guns, and money. Send lawyers, guns, and money.
Welcome back to Conduct Detrimental, episode number 55, Gary Reasons. And there are many reasons to believe, if you're a fan of the New York Rangers, we are recording this episode on the day that the New York Rangers, for the second year in a row, rose significantly in the NHL draft lottery. But this time around, instead of getting the number 2 pick overall, they landed the biggest player of them all in this year's draft. He's been compared to many of the other great players that have come out of the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League. His name is Alexis Lafreniere. But this NHL draft lottery was not without its share of controversy. Just as there was the frozen envelope in 1985 for Patrick Ewing, this lottery has its own controversy, and we are introducing the weighted ball. And we'll address that, I think, on a future episode. But this was an unplanned interjection, and we'll have to deal with the Lafreniere fallout on a future episode. So for now, I'm going to welcome in my co-host, Dan Lust, as usual, for our 55th episode, maybe the 10th together. So what's on the docket today, Dan, and how are you?
I'm good, Dan. That was quite the introduction. But before we start, Dan, do you smell that? Do you smell what's cooking? Because, Dan, I
correct
smell
predictions?
it.
Do we smell correct predictions that
I
pan
smell
out?
and I smell what The Rock is cooking, Dan, because last time on this very show, episode 54, we talked about The Rock purchasing the XFL. We had a lot of fun with it, but you were very adamant. I remember I pinned it, and I was very, I wanted to make sure this came true, but you said something was fishy about The Rock's purchase, that he would be getting, the $60 million worth of insider claims. That there might have been it didn't smell right, that The Rock would be in control of those claims when that's really disadvantageous to Vince McMahon, his former boss. So you kind of put yourself out there as you've done in the past. And usually when you do that, Dan, we could call you Dan Wallach. We can also call you Dan Stradamus, because you tend to be right when you make these predictions. And as you predicted, the sale did go through, but those insider claims were taken out of the purchase. So I just want to give you some credit there, Dan. You laid the people's elbow on that prediction.
Yeah, you could call me the amazing Crisp Dan if you want as well. But it just really does.
I like the people's champion.
It does underscore the importance of putting in a significant amount of research, looking, sort of at the case files, the schedules. I mean, evaluating a bankruptcy situation is a little bit more challenging than looking at a court file generally, because you've got all these disclosure schedules. And, as I started to wade through those disclosure schedules, what stood out for me was that the real value of the sale wasn't the assets associated with the league, but it was the potential claims against insiders, which to me seemed like it had greater value than the XFL itself, and was being accorded basically no value in the purchase price, and would basically strip the estate and leave creditors with essentially, nothing to show for over $60 million of potential causes of action. So yeah, I think it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure it out. It just took a little bit of elbow grease and looking at the schedules and trying to make sense of what was included in the sale and whether that was commensurate with the purchase price. So I'll take that one as a W, but if you're in this game long enough, Dan, each of us are going to have our share of predictions that go awry, but we can't be afraid to give an immediate take and to, lend, our best guess, educated guess as to where things will go in a particular legal controversy. So what do we have today?
We have a couple things untapped. I think there's an interesting transition just from the XFL, but, today being Monday, the news today and probably the news for this week, many have said that this could be the red wedding of college football this week with all conferences canceling. And that was the news all weekend. And then today, we'll get into it with some kind of back and forth, some interesting players weighing in. So number one, we're going to talk about the current state of college football, some amateurism issues, some Title IX issues, and maybe some talk about the union that took place Northwestern back in 2014, 2015. So that's number one, the big story we want to get to. Number two is this interesting story that's kind of developing, kind of the tables turning in terms of opt-outs in Major League Baseball. Obviously, we saw with Yoenis Cespedes last weekend, but now the new story, Marcus Stroman for the New York Mets, kind of turning the tables on the service time manipulation issue. So I definitely want to get into that. Number three, the story that I know, Dan, is very near and dear to your heart, an update on the DeAndre Baker, Quinton Dunbar legal situation, a very big turn of events in the past couple of days. So obviously have to break that down. And then number four, Dan, a guest that you were very kind to bring to the show, Jeremy Kudon, to talk about, and obviously a heavy hitter in the sports betting lobbyist industry, fellow attorney, and he's going to break down the current legislation in Illinois. But Dan, before we get into the rundown, What I do want to get into, I just had this crazy thought where we could have a world really in this college football season where there is no college football, right? I think everyone is considering that could be a possibility. Now, to the extent there is no college football season, that doesn't stop the NFL draft. So all of a sudden, we're kind of sitting here, Dan, it's August 1st. If there is a world where there's no college football season, but there is a draft, this could be the time, right, where there was a secondary league, be it something like the XFL, that could have really benefited from a flow of college players. There is no AAF. There is no XFL. So I think the XFL's timing is maybe a year or two off. This could have been a gigantic coup to the extent that college football is canceled. Trevor Lawrence wants to go to the pros next year. I'm just kind of seeing the writing on the wall just as a sports fan. I think this is a huge missed opportunity for a potential competitor to the NFL to, have a USFL version like they had, 20, 30, 40 years ago. What are your overall thoughts, I guess, on just before we get into the college football topic, what could have been and what might be with this NFL draft?
Well, I think when you're talking about the cancellation of the college football season, or at least the potential cancellation, when I think of the NFL draft, I think of a year of no game tape. It will make the April 2021 NFL draft one of the most volatile in recent histories, with many major misses and, maybe some, coups or steals later in the draft, because so many of the players that rise in the NFL draft in the eyes of scouts do so on the basis of their last year of game tape. And now there will be nothing. I mean, for someone like Trevor Lawrence, this is like a non-issue. I know he badly wants to come back and play, but whether he plays or just sits it out and hangs out at home for a year, he is going to be the number one or one of the top picks in next year's NFL draft. This isn't about Trevor Lawrence. This is really about, there are a number of issues in play, but the NFL draft next year is going to make or break the careers of many general managers who, if you had a lot riding on your number one or number two pick and you can't afford to really mess it up, I think the margin for error has gone up significantly if you're going to remove an entire season of college football and leave these professional evaluators with nothing to go on except for combines and, stopwatch and having them, run a 40-yard dash somewhere. So it's going to set up a really interesting situation, at least for the transition into the pro league. I mean, even in normal years, general managers make mistakes. I mean, and one of our topics later on in the show is going to be DeAndre Baker. You have a situation where Dave Gettleman, the general manager of the Giants, traded valuable draft capital to move up to take DeAndre Baker, of whom he had significant game tape in Baker's, last season of collegiate football. You remove that ability from every NFL general manager, there's going to be a wide deviation between where players are selected relative to where they should be taken. And it's just going to be a great unknown. I think the GMs and the scouts in the NFL are going to have much less information, from which to make sensible evaluations. And we're going to see a lot of general managers just screw up, and others that are just going to step in it and get really lucky by taking 5th round, 6th round players who maybe if they had better game tape in their senior or junior seasons would rise up and become 1st and 2nd rounders. So it will benefit those general managers and scouting departments that have been around for a couple of years and that are not just, new to the scene and were just hired. It will really benefit franchises, like the Patriots or any of the teams that have a significant amount of, former college coaches that have a pipeline to the current NCAA, coaching industry. So I'm really interested to see how this impacts how players get drafted into the NFL. But that's just one little microcosm or one little micro issue of dozens of issues.
So I think that's a good place to set the table. So let's get into it. Our first formal topic, I'll try to set the stage. It's an interesting development these past couple of days. So reports again this weekend were that it was essentially doomsday for this week of college football. We were talking in the last podcast how the Pac-12 had a list of demands. We didn't have our podcast about it, but the Big Ten separately, their players had a list of demands. The Mountain West had a list of demands. So all of a sudden these players start mobilizing. And then, what happens on the other end, maybe there's cause and effect, maybe they're unrelated, but reports start to trickle out, that the MAC football has canceled their season. The Mountain West officially today canceled their season, but those aren't the Power 5 conferences. So, the smaller schools don't necessarily have the money to play during a COVID era for the extra rapid response tests. So that wasn't necessarily the death knell for college football, at least for Power 5 college football. That's Big 12, Big 10, Pac-12, SEC, and ACC. Now, that being said, we did have reports yesterday on Sunday that started to trickle out that this week we have these cancellations. So the first two dominoes that were supposed to fall were the Pac-12 and Big Ten. And across sports media, Twitter media, however you want to call it, people started to write their stories already today that the season was going to be canceled. And enough blue check marks were talking about impending cancellation of the season. So all of a sudden we had an issue today where a vote apparently happened this morning. And then I guess that was reported by our fellow Dan Patrick, reported that a 12-2 margin, some type of vote in the Big 12 occurred. And Dan Patrick was, texting, I was reading text from a source of his, that there was a vote that occurred and 12-2 margin that had passed. And blue checkmark Twitter started picking it up. We all kind of said, okay, that's the story we were all waiting for. Everyone got ready to write their stories. Twitter went crazy for about 2-3 hours. And all of a sudden, a Big Ten spokesperson reached out, I guess to the people in the media and said, well, the presidents and the chancellors haven't voted yet. So the vote's not official. So everyone kind of had that record scratch moment. So what does that really mean? Does that mean that college football is not canceled or you just weren't ready to announce it yet? So anyway, Dan, we sit here, we're recording this on Monday night. None of the Power 5 schools have officially canceled or postponed. Now, I want to turn it to you, Dan. The first thing that caught, I think, both of our eyes was a thread that Trevor Lawrence, that we were just mentioning, had posted last night about saving the season. So I'm just going to read this to you. And Dan, I want to get your overall thoughts on this, because this obviously, you don't normally have a college quarterback, first top pick, making these kind of statements. So this is Trevor Lawrence from his Twitter account. People are just as much, if not more at risk if we don't play. Players will be sent home to their own communities where social distancing is highly unlikely and medical care and expenses will be placed on the families if they were to contract COVID-19. Not to mention the players coming from situations that are not good for them / their future and having to go back to that. Football is a safe haven for so many people. We are more likely to get the virus in everyday life than playing football. Having a season also incentivizes players being safe and taking all of the right precautions to try and avoid contracting COVID because the season / teammate safety is on the line. Without the season, as we've seen, people will not social distance or wear masks or take proper precautions. So, Dan, I will turn it to you. The only follow-up I have is Trevor Lawrence today retweeted a tweet, with a message from all the conferences. And it says, all the conferences, # we are united. We want to play football this season. And Trevor Lawrence is a quote retweet and just writes # we want to play. So Trevor Lawrence is putting his name in front of him. A lot of obviously support for Trevor Lawrence. So what are your thoughts overall on that? And how legitimate do you think his concerns are?
Well, I mean, I find it kind of troubling and ironic that it's Trevor Lawrence who's leading the charge on this. First of all, his draft status is not going to be impacted at all whether he plays or doesn't play. But maybe he has a very short memory, but it wasn't too long ago. And I'm presently living in Oconee County, South Carolina, which is basically one county away from Clemson. It wasn't too long ago that there were over 30 positive tests associated with the Clemson football team.
You don't say, Dan. You don't say.
So, I don't know what he's thinking that somehow, you put 85, scholarship players from a FBS program together in close proximity in a full contact sport. And that's going to be safer than staying at home and not having that kind of daily physical contact where people are sweating on each other, bleeding on each other. I mean, you don't need a medical degree to, say that, playing competitive sports in a full contact sport like football is higher risk from a COVID-19 perspective than sitting at home. So neither he or I are experts on this subject, obviously, but the Clemson scenario looms large. And then if professional athletes, such as those on the St. Louis Cardinals and the Miami Marlins, can't be trusted or violating protocols, and they're adults who have, salaries and families, and they've got more responsibility. If professional athletes can't be trusted to obey these COVID-19 protocols, what does it say about the risk factor associated with college athletes? They're much younger, on average, a little bit more immature, maybe more likely to go out to a bar, and there are many more of them. On a baseball team, you have 25. On a college football team, you have 85. So the risk factor associated with college athletes not following the protocols is 3 times as great as it is for Major League Baseball players who don't play a contact sport, yet have had a significant amount of COVID-19, issues pop up during the course of this return to play. I mean, it's afflicted a number of teams. It's caused cancellations. And you have to ask yourself whether the business of college football is important enough to subject potentially 11,000, players, because that's the universe of the 130 schools that comprise, big time college football. 11,000 potential players. You're going to put them in that kind of an environment and potentially create, health risks, long-term health risks that we don't necessarily know about yet. I think the smarter play is to hit the pause button right now and evaluate this on a rolling basis. There's no rule that says you can't play college football in the spring. I think the sensible approach is to pause it now and reevaluate it as a possibility for the spring.
A lot of things to unpack. And I think, first to Trevor Lawrence's comments, I guess first of all, I was pretty vocal last night on Twitter and people that follow me. No, I'm very in support of the bubble. I think the bubble is great to the extent that you can afford it. I think it presents the safest way to play games. Now, am I in support of all the sports necessarily playing? I don't feel so strongly one way or the other. It depends on a case-by-case basis. But I do feel strongly that if you do play, the safest way to do it is in a bubble. And I think that just objectively speaks to it. So
how can you do a bubble, though, in NCAA college football with so many teams? Are we going to limit it to just the major conferences?
Are you ready for this? Because I have the whole thing planned out. Well, I guess for the Trevor Lawrence part, I could buy what Trevor Lawrence is saying if he leaves the campus, right? And people are more at risk and, they're safer on campus. But that really is an assumption that the schools are going to pick up the medical tab and they're going to take on this liability risk and they want you there and they're going to pay, have the different medical doctors helping you. And if there is COVID, an outbreak on campus, they're going to take care of it. And that's the financial investment that I'm not convinced that college football is going to take. So now to this bubble, because I've thought about it. So how are you going to have 100 plus teams in a bubble, 100 plus football teams? You really can't. Now, before anyone starts yelling at me, I know that the bubble is not legally doable, but I think it's just an interesting thought experiment. Number one, we have all these conferences now that are planning to play in-conference games only. If you're going to only play in-conference games, that's setting the table for a conference bubble. It's not such a crazy thought. You have 10 teams in the bubble. You're in the bubble for, 10 weeks, 11 weeks, if you want to have a bye in there. It's not that crazy of a concept. And no one's going to convince me that a Power 5 school doesn't have the resources for a bubble. But needless to say, we've never heard whispers about a bubble. Even in Major League Baseball, there were considerations of a bubble. They declined to do it. Manfred said it wasn't practical to do it, but they considered it. I've never heard at any point in these past 6 months that college football ever even considered it. Now, why is that, Dan? And that's to this point of why the bubble is actually illegal. To the extent you had a college football bubble, which, again, I don't think they have considered, you'd have to give these football players, we'll say, special treatment and acknowledge that these guys are earning revenue for the school. So we're going to give them special treatment. We're not going to give the special treatment to maybe their students, number one, but we're going to give college football players special treatment and not women's soccer players or women's volleyball players or any other sport. So number one, I think you walk into a very easy challenge in terms of Title IX. I think that's just the first thing. You'd have to have a bubble for every sport. And then number two, Dan, I think once you start acknowledging that these football players are revenue generation and they deserve separate treatment, I think you do walk into a world where your amateurism model is called into question. If these are really amateurs, why are they getting special treatment, right? Because they make you revenue. So I think those are the two things there. And I think as I kind of sit here, if the NCAA really wanted to, they could blow up this amateurism model and help the women's soccer players, women's basketball players, and make bubbles for everybody, and make these little condensed universe bubbles. No one's going to tell me there's not enough money to do it. But that being said, Dan, I'm reading the writing on the wall. I think that the NCAA would rather cancel their seasons than risk their long-term health of this business model. I don't think it's so controversial, but I don't know why the season necessarily needs to be canceled. If we're playing, the NFL is going to play, and bubbles have succeeded. Hockey bubbles, they're very big endeavors with 30 teams, but no even conversations about that at the college level.
I think it's a great idea conceptually, but the indoor sports lend themselves much better to a bubble environment because of the facility size. A football stadium's a little bit different. Where are you going to create what states are going to have sufficient number of venues to be able to house even if it's within a conference. It's not exactly a very easy to achieve situation. And these are not, while they generate a lot of money for their school, the athletes aren't being paid. They're not professionals. And it's one thing for an NFL player, an NBA, or an NHL player to decide to accept the risk associated with COVID-19 because they're getting paid money. They're earning a livelihood. But to place amateur athletes in harm's way for no compensation. And they will undoubtedly face, I don't know, I disagree with Trevor Lawrence. I mean, they will face a higher risk by being in close proximity with so many other athletes in a full contact sport. What's in it for them? What's really in it for them except for, I guess, economic down the road, opportunities where if they have a good, good junior or senior season, maybe they'll improve their draft status. And I certainly understand wanting to play, but you have to take a cost benefit analysis here. And for a school that is now, expressly forbidden by the NCAA from having COVID-19 waivers, the big time college schools are now, not allowed to do that. How can you limit the risk associated with putting thousands of football players, almost 11,000 if you add up all of the 130 schools? That becomes a significant liability risk that can't be contracted away, and nor should it be contracted away when the participants aren't earning any money. And now, I think that's how you differentiate the NFL and all the professional leagues from what's taking place on the college level. The schools are making money, but the athletes aren't.
Dan, that's a fantastic point. And it brings me, I guess, to this, we'll say it's like part 1B of this college football discussion. I don't think anybody, well, I don't want to say anybody, but I don't think enough people realize that if the Big Ten, let's say the Big Ten cancels their season, or the Mountain West cancels their season, it doesn't automatically mean that the schools within that conference are done. It does not mean that. And I just want to read you a quote from the coach of the Nebraska football team. So he says, "Our university is committed to playing no matter what. No matter what that looks like and how that looks. We want to play no matter who it is or where it is." And now this one, Dan, is from Nebraska, mind you, is in the Big Ten. Now the Air Force athletic director, and Air Force is in the Mountain West, which has already postponed football for the season. The Air Force's athletic director, Nate Pine, says that despite Mountain West canceling full football season, Air Force will have the opportunity to continue to explore competitions against Army and Navy if conditions allow, as we have similar physical missions across the service academies. All of a sudden, Dan, I don't think people really have caught wind of this or appreciate it. You could have a world where certain teams and schools are openly saying that they'll fracture or splinter away from that conference because they want to play. Nebraska says no matter what. So now, Dan, back to the point you just brought up. This is again from our fellow Dan, maybe future friend Dan. If we can
I don't know. Is Dan Patrick sitting in his studio thinking of us as fellow Dans? Because that's certainly the goal down the road. But I don't think we're on his radar yet. But I'm waiting for that. Fellow Dan reference from Dan Patrick. That would be pretty awesome.
We're still going to be fellow Dans whether or not we're on his radar. So he cannot take that away from us. But fellow Dan laid it out in the show. We guess he has a source. Again, I kind of referenced it, but he said Big Ten, Pac-12 are leaning towards cancellation. SEC and the Big 12 are kind of on the fence. And the SEC separately, Dan, wants to play. And they want to bring one of those other two Power 5 conferences, I guess, in some kind of pseudo season. We have a world, Dan, and this is again per our fellow Dan, where we could have a miniature, mini college season. So maybe a bubble is doable in that world because those schools want to generate money. And, again, when the further you move towards different red states, those guys want to play. And now, Dan, this brings me to my third point. And I do want to get your take on this as it falls in. Dan, you and I, we don't get political on the podcast. Sports are our political views, but we do have to address big political people when they step into the conversation because it does weigh in. President Trump today in a not so veiled tweet writes, "Play college football!" ! Whether or not we wanted to have politics in this conversation, they are now very much injected into this decision. What are your overall thoughts? I guess I gave you a lot of stuff, Dan, but what are your overall thoughts on colleges splintering and then maybe the role of President Trump's comments in all this?
Well, thanks for the question. President Trump's comments are only going to carry sway in states that are politically, aligned with him. In Florida, obviously, state like Alabama, Georgia, but California, marches to a different beat. And I don't think the president's comments have quite the influence that many people think they do. I think the state governors of those states are probably encouraging this, the return to normalcy of businesses, and Governor DeSantis in Florida, certainly chief among them. I just don't think it's I don't think it's an impactful thing what President Trump says about this issue. This is ultimately going to come down to judgment call made by college and university presidents about health and safety issues affecting their constituents. Their mission and their fiduciary duty and their contractual duty is to, what's in the best interest of the university. Politics aside, you may see some conference leaders falling into, sort of lockstep with President Trump's comments. But I think the vast majority of university presidents are going to make decisions based upon what's best for the school and what's best for the students and the student athletes. And I think it's absolutely reckless to move forward with a college football season when so many pockets of this country are experiencing a resurgence. Illinois has a record number of cases the last couple of days, and we're going to talk about Illinois a little later in the episode. Florida is a hot spot. I mean, this is absolutely, it almost borders on criminally reckless to think about putting unpaid people in a position where they have to play football when their fellow students are learning virtually at home. I mean, we're not putting biology students in a bubble, Dan. We're putting college football players only as a special class. And I think hopefully common sense, wisdom, responsibility, and sound judgment will prevail at the end of this day. And I don't underestimate university presidents who are in a position to make that call, because they've got to answer not only to boards of trustees and to donors, but they've got to answer to students and parents of students. And I don't know how you look a student's parents in the eyes and say, this was the right decision in the face of all this medical evidence and all of the worsening conditions that are happening in way too many states.
Dan, do you watch Always Sunny in Philadelphia?
I used to, yes. That definitely was up there for a number of years for me.
So the reason I ask, there's an episode where they're having a debate, but there's a Dennis and Dee, they have reason will prevail. And then, Charlie and Mac, they say pickles will prevail. So I think you had me thinking about that as you were going on.
Is that show still on the air, Dan? Are they still filming?
Is that show still on the air, Dan? I mean, Dan.
What is it, 20 seasons already? I mean, I think that show jumped the shark a while ago, or is it?
Dan, this is blasphemous. Okay, I'm not going to have you speak about Always Sunny this way. Okay. So Dan, I do want to kind of push back a little, because you and I agree on most things. So again, we're attorneys. We have to argue the other side of this. There are players in this world. I don't want to say it's all football players, but there are enough, and I'm watching them pop up on my feed. Big name players, Trevor Lawrence obviously being one of the biggest, that are saying we want to play. We're now, Dan, 5 months into a pandemic. I don't think it's crazy that at this point we know that it's very risky to play. Obviously, nobody knows the exact risk of COVID because we're only 5 months in. It's a very small sample size. You have a guy like Eduardo Rodriguez, who has in baseball for the Red Sox, one of their top pitchers, has a heart issue. We don't really know what the long-term ramifications of this are. But that being said, some of these athletes, they say, we don't care. We want to play. There is a term that, I post funny videos and I just write the term assumption of the risk. That's the concept that these players are arguing here. We don't need to sign a COVID liability waiver. We know what the risk is. We want to play. If we play in a bubble, we don't want to play in a bubble. We don't care. We want to play. So I just, there's a version of this, and these guys have worked their whole life to get to this college level, to be in the national landscape. And for some of them, playing during, a COVID situation, a pandemic, that will represent 1/3 of their possible playing time in a starting job. And again, maybe there's even guys that have fought their whole year and they're finally seniors and they finally have a starting spot. And this is the only opportunity, because if football is canceled, Dan, I just want to put it out there. There is no guarantee that the eligibility will be extended. So I'm just putting it out there. I do understand the logic why someone would force to have the season.
Yeah, Dan, football's not being canceled. Playing in the fall is being canceled.
I don't know about that.
For many of these students, for most of these students, the academic year, the graduation is in May, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that we could be playing college football games in January, February, March, and April. I think it's unlikely.
I don't know about that.
Okay, well, it's certainly something that should be looked at a little bit more closely, but where's it etched in stone or written as a law that you can only play football during the fall? Obviously, that's the
I think it's in the Constitution, Dan. I think you must have missed that day and time off.
Well, I do recall the USFL, the Canadian Football League. Listen, these are unusual times, unprecedented times, and I think creative solutions are going to be needed. One-off solutions that may not necessarily be sensible 5 years from now, but I think we're all trying to figure out how to get in a season, what might make sense under the circumstances, and I think we need to be flexible and open-minded about the possibilities here. So let's wrap this one up and move on to our next topic. And what is that going to be?
So we're going to talk some baseball, Dan. But before we get into this baseball issue, I should give a quick shout out to my new social media friend, Mike Piazza. Dan, did you see Mike Piazza going back and forth with me on Twitter?
Yeah. Absolutely. That was very impressive. Mike Piazza. I don't know what he's doing these days. Doesn't he own a soccer team in Italy?
Do you know what he's doing, Dan? He's being my best friend. is being my best friend on not only Twitter, but also on Instagram, Dan, because Mike Piazza knows that I, as a youth little leaguer, was a catcher, and I had the Mike Piazza signature glove. So he knew that. He must have intuitively.
It's always so heartwarming when I see two Hall of Famers interacting with each other. And,
I'm the other Hall of Famer in this equation, correct?
Yes.
I'm not sure which Hall of Fame, but I'm sure I'm in one somewhere. Maybe the backup catcher Hall of Fame. But that being said, Dan, let us get into the issue in Major League Baseball. I think it's just an interesting one that you and I haven't spoke about for years in the Major League Baseball context. For those law students that listen to this that participated in the Tulane baseball arbitration competition, the concept of service time in Major League Baseball is very key. That is this framework within baseball, the amount of days and seasons you have played. It'll get you to free agency at a certain period of time, or a little bit quicker. So first, it's a handful of years are going to be under team control. The first 3 years are basically while you're in the pros, are on basically a minimum contract. You're at the team's complete and utter control. And then there's this window of time. There's a Super 2 window up until the point where you're a third-time arbitration eligible player. But your salary is you're under team control. It's basically a series of 1-year contracts. But the arbitrator and an arbitration panel gets to determine your salary. So once you can hit arbitration, right, and once you're finished with those 3 years, you can hit free agency. But that's all contingent on getting enough service time to get you to that level. So that being said, for years, Dan, there have been players. I remember them. Probably the best example is Kris Bryant a couple years ago. I was looking at these stats with my dad the other day. Kris Bryant had a season in the minor leagues where he hit 40 homers and had 100 plus RBIs. If you do that in the minor leagues at a decently high level, there is nothing else for you to prove at the minor league level. Yeah, when the season turned, and I remember in my fantasy baseball league, Kris Bryant's ADP was like 55. The fantasy community was ready to explode on him. But Dan, he wasn't in the pros. So that was what people accused the Cubs for, of service time manipulation, to have an extra year of control. And then Dan, Kris Bryant filed a grievance and he lost. The Cubs were not deemed to have manipulated service time. So that's kind of the backdrop of how teams have been accused of manipulating service time. So Dan, now I turn it to you. Do you want to break down the news that has happened today in the Marcus Stroman New York Mets universe?
Well, I guess that's, turnabout's fair play. We could call this the revenge of Kris Bryant. It's usually the teams that are in the position of manipulating service time. And that was a pretty egregious case. Not only did he have that stellar minor league season, but he was also the Cubs' leading hitter during spring training that year. And they brought him up. They recalled him the day, the day after, or the same day at which, they could have brought him up without having to credit him 1 year towards free agency. That was about as egregious of a case as it gets. And I'm still surprised that the Cubs won that grievance. It really is. I mean, if players aren't going to win that case.
Here. We don't believe in
coincidences here. If the player can't win that case, there's no service time manipulation case that's ever winnable. And that's something that needs to be rectified. So I shed no tears for Major League Baseball or for the New York Mets. I mean, that's the risk that comes with players opting out. And it's not only Stroman, but there were other players who were traded during the offseason and with the expectation that they would contribute to their clubs the following year. That the teams would have one more year of service associated with those players. So all that goes out the window. And I applaud Marcus Stroman. I think he made a selfish decision, but one that really is the smart decision, because Stroman, regardless of what he does the rest of the season, he has only downside risk associated with playing. He could get hurt. He could have a bad season, in which case, in either of those scenarios, his free agency value would crater. If he does nothing and just steps away, he already assures himself that he's going to be one of the most in-demand starting pitchers during the next offseason. So it's no big surprise that Marcus Stroman is opting out, particularly given the risks involved or associated with playing. And when you also consider that the Mets are not going to be a contender, this lined up to be a fairly easy decision for Marcus Stroman.
So for those that, just as a quick background, the Mets actually made a trade for Marcus Stroman, and they were trying to get him for his contract year coming off. So they gave up Anthony Kay, who's, a serviceable major league pitcher, and then, another prospect. And Stroman was with the team for a total of 11 games. And the Mets gave up 2 decent pieces to get 11 games of Marcus Stroman. So Marcus Stroman, I guess he has some very smart agents who looked at the numbers and said, hey, Marcus, if you opt out right now, you can just hit free agency. There is no downside to doing this. So all of a sudden, and I made it, a quick joke on Twitter, but the tables have kind of turned. So last week with Cespedes opting out with no notice. He just didn't show up one day. And now we see Marcus Stroman, who just kind of leaves. So it's, obviously not the best news for the Mets. I think it's just coincidental that it's 2 players in the same team. Dan, kind of interesting to see. We've spoke about this again. You and I have both been vocal about this. I think that the Major League Baseball Players Association and the league, they didn't really think this through. Players just can be opting out whenever they want in the season. I get that COVID risk is very real. Players, their risk tolerance will change over the course of the season. But this can't be that fair for teams. They're just having players drop like flies at a moment's notice, and there's no real predictability to it. There's no window. There's no days that guys can opt out, and you could just go to the ballpark one day, and then Yoenis Cespedes is not there, and there's no ramifications for it. And there's still no ramifications for opting out with no notice to the team. So I just think that was a misstep on the negotiation.
Yeah, I think the entire season has been just an unmitigated disaster. It's not just the opting out, but
tell us how you really feel, Dan.
Cancellation of games, the staggered schedule where teams that are facing one another, have a disparity in the number of games played, cancellation of series. I mean, this 60-game season is just going to be over in a heartbeat. And as I mentioned on the last episode, I'm a Yankees fan, and honestly, I'm not even aware that they're playing because the news, that seems to dominate is everything associated with COVID-19. 60 games is not a representative season. And whoever is awarded the World Series at the end of this year, maybe they think that they'll earn it. This is not going to be viewed as similar to the 1981 split season. I think this season is a write-off. And I applaud someone like Marcus Stroman making a decision that's in his personal best interest because he has his career to look forward to and has to think down the road. There's no upside for playing here other than, I guess whatever remaining salary you're going to earn. And I say the same thing for every other sport, but I would say the NBA and the NHL are certainly going about it better. And there's more enthusiasm and fan interest around those games. And surprisingly, Major League Baseball so far has been one giant dud. And you question some of the decisions that were made early on about how to structure this, bubble versus no bubble. This is really, going off the rails fairly quickly.
So I think we can put a pin in that topic, Dan. And I want to take us now to our third topic, Dan. And this is one that I know, as much as you love the Rangers, I think your love for the New York Giants might run a little bit deeper than that. And this is a story, Dan, you and I have been following.
No, that's sacrilege. It's Rangers 1A, Giants 1B.
So I'm going to respectfully disagree because I think I know your fandom from your tweets better. You definitely tweet more about the Giants and the Rangers, Dan. I'm gonna hold you to that. Dan's face, no one can see this in the Zoom, but he is not happy with that I just said that. I'm kidding. I'm totally 100% kidding. That being said, I used to work for the Giants in their PR department. Dan's a big Giants fan, so this is a topic we both enjoy getting into. DeAndre Baker, Quinton Dunbar, I think everyone knows the charge at this point. It's an alleged armed robbery. For the longest time, these two players had been kind of a package deal. Either they were both at fault or neither was at fault. And that's not because they have the same lawyers. It's just because, in our legal system, it's innocent until proven guilty. There were 4 witnesses, 1 victim that gave a version to police that seemed to incriminate both players. Then all of a sudden, all 5 of them recanted in various versions, but it didn't really show so, we'll say, beneficially in terms of their credibility. So if the witnesses aren't credible, that would seem to benefit both, and it's both Quinton Dunbar and DeAndre Baker. Now, that being said, Dan, we haven't heard that much of the case since then. We just kind of knew the witnesses were out there. We heard some kind of maybe a handful of, a little posturing from both legal sides. But that being said, at the end of last week, we have news that which surprised me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then I'm sure everyone will, that the charges were dropped as to Quinton Dunbar due to insufficient evidence. Meanwhile, DeAndre Baker is being charged with 4 very serious charges that range from 10 years to life in prison, which is not what I expected. And I expected one of the players to get fully dropped. So what are your thoughts overall on the situation?
Well, I think the difference in the treatment for Baker relative to Dunbar, I think you can look at some of the witness testimony. The charging affidavit, the probable cause affidavit included a number of witness statements made to law enforcement witnesses. Every witness had put Baker at the scene with a gun in his hands, and he was sort of the ringleader of this. But with respect to Dunbar, there was like a diversion or deviation in the testimony or the recorded statements. 2 of the witnesses said that he was there and had a gun, and then 2 other witnesses says he didn't have a gun. So I think from the prosecutor's perspective, it was a tougher judgment call with respect to Dunbar because the witness statements didn't line up quite the same way as they did with DeAndre Baker, where the initial witness statements given to law enforcement had much more consistency and a consensus about Baker's involvement in the alleged crime, whereas even with respect to Dunbar, the witnesses who had him present there, 2 of them said he didn't have a gun. Two of them said he did have a gun. There were issues certainly surrounding the witness statements and the alleged bribery scheme, but it just seemed that the evidence that was, that had seen the light of day appeared to be much stronger pointed against Baker than against Dunbar. But, just because Quinton Dunbar escaped criminal charges, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be playing this year, because satisfying or avoiding criminal prosecution does not mean that you're in the clear in the National Football League under the league's personal conduct policy, which has a much lower standard of proof for, being found responsible in the criminal courts. As anyone in our audience who's gone to law school, or maybe who hasn't gone to law school, knows that you need to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's about the highest standard that exists in the law. But in the NFL's personal conduct policy, credible evidence is all that's needed to justify a suspension under the personal conduct policy. And I think some of these witness affidavits or statements given to law enforcement officers may serve or could serve as the requisite credible evidence, even with respect to Quinton Dunbar. So he may be out of the woods, from a criminal perspective, but there's a very good chance that he's going to find himself suspended by the National Football League once the league commences and concludes its investigation. But one early benefit for Dunbar is that I think he's going to get off the NFL's commissioner's exempt list, because without formal charges, the use of the exempt list does not attach. And I would think that he'd be allowed to play, or he would come off that exempt list right away. So I would expect on one level the NFL to ramp up its investigation to, maybe have a resolution prior to the start of the NFL season, before the NFL is placed in the unusual situation of having an accused or once accused armed felon suiting up for a game.
So I'm going to, Dan, I see that. And I think you're right. I think, that whether these guys play or not play is a different issue. Innocent until proven guilty does not apply to the National Football League, because you could be completely innocent of all charges and still get suspended. But Dan, I want to just kind of go back to these actual witnesses. So what we know, Dan, I think objectively, and you can tell me if this is not objective, if it's just me kind of weighing in here, but these witnesses and the four victims and the one witness contradicted themselves under sworn testimony, right? I mean, we can agree that's objective. They've done that. I find it hard to believe, and I'm listening to everything you're saying. I don't disagree that there was more evidence against DeAndre Baker than there was against Quinton Dunbar. But there's a version of me, and I briefly was on the criminal defense side. I worked for a former Manhattan DA, and then I'm reading Bradford Cohn's statement. That's the lawyer for DeAndre Baker. Why do we believe anything the witnesses say at this point? If they've already shown this ability to flip-flop and to lie under oath, right? They've given one sworn statement to prosecutors, and they turned around and gave a contradictory statement to attorneys. And now, Dan, you didn't mention this part, which again, I mean, if people haven't listened to all the episodes, Dan, there was a little bit of suspicious terms as to how these contradictory statements were obtained. This is this allegation that the attorney on Quinton Dunbar's side, again, an allegation, but paid witnesses to change their version of events. So again, we don't need to talk about whether or not that actually happened, but there's enough smoke that these witnesses not only changed their testimony, but change their testimony because they were paid to do so. So I'm of the opinion, Dan, and I can make the argument, why don't you just throw out everything that these witnesses have said? I mean, can we really buy anything that they're saying at this point?
Well, by the same token, and I'm usually, defense oriented when it comes to some of the criminal cases, most of the criminal cases, but can you believe anything the lawyers are saying? The lawyers have been, take a look at Brad Cohen's. He's DeAndre Baker's, criminal defense lawyer. He tweeted the following a couple of days ago: "We need a change in the old guard in Broward County. It can't be the same charge now, and let the courts sort it out. This is what got us to where we are now with the state of the system." I mean, come on. The burden of proof still resides with the prosecution. The courts are not going to sort it out. You know who's going to sort it out? The prosecution has to carry their burden of proof and persuade a jury that DeAndre Baker committed this crime of armed robbery with proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So the burden always remains with the prosecution. This is not simply the state attorney's office throwing its hands up in the air and saying, let's let the courts set it out. I think that's a bogus statement made by Mr. Cohen. And, we don't know what evidence in totality the state attorney's office was looking at. We have certainly the original law enforcement officer's probable cause affidavit, but I would have expected that in the 2 months that have ensued since the 2.5 months since the original arrest, there's been much deeper investigation being done by the state attorney's office, and there may be more proof that they have that are not necessarily reflected in the court file. And certainly the defendants or now the defendant singular is going to be requesting copies of, going to make this, Brad Cohen is going to make a request for discovery and have all of the written documents associated with the investigation at his disposal. But at this point, I don't think we can just freeze the original law enforcement officer recorded statements, put those, just kind of view those as the sole and exclusive evidence that the state attorney's office relied on. They proceeded very cautiously and carefully here and took their time, and they're going to have to make their case. And we don't know to what extent every witness recanted their testimony. We'll certainly find out, because in Florida, you cannot justify a criminal conviction on recanted testimony. So if every witness recants, guess what? No conviction will stand legally. So the state attorney's office must have a little bit more in the way of evidence than just what's in that original probable cause affidavit.
So that's my take on it too. I was on the Locked On Giants podcast over the weekend, and I pointed out, I go, just from what we are aware of in the public realm, it's just these witness statements, and we knew that was the witness statements were the reason for these charges. But it just would make sense. I mean, you had the same thought I did, that there is something else that the prosecution is relying on that we don't have yet. Now, over the course of this case, obviously DeAndre Baker, just with how discovery works, he's going to get access to that. It's not a matter of whether we might not get it as the public. Obviously, FOIL requests can only go so far during an active case. But I just think there's something else out there. I don't necessarily.
In Florida, a public records request will get you very far. An active investigation certainly carries with it an exemption from disclosure. But once that information is turned over to the defense under Florida law, the media can get access to all of the investigative reports and evidence.
Did Pat Leonard teach you that one?
No. I learned I learned that one about the Robert Kraft case. I haven't practiced as criminal defense attorney, but the same, media requests and evidentiary issues with respect to public records requests made by media companies. I think we'll soon see that emerge with someone like Leonard or one of the other reporters who are following the story. I mean, you or I could request a copy of the investigative file, because as soon as it's turned over to the defense, I think it becomes fair game as a public record, at least under Florida law.
Then I think, Dan, just using our deductive reasoning here, then I think it's fair to conclude, and I'm just reading Bradford Cohn's, Instagram post, similar to what you said. He goes, disgusting, and no, I won't hold back on behalf of this young man. To charge a young man based on admitted liar's testimony is why we need a change in Broward County. So it's the same type of quote you had. But I just think there's something that the prosecution must be relying on that we don't have access to, because it doesn't really make sense to me that you'd rest the entire case on these witness statements, but acquit one and the other one is charged. Yeah. And I think
they can't be accused. The state attorney's office can't be accused of overcharging here, because with respect to Baker, I mean, they originally had 8 counts in the original arrest. 4 of them were dropped. I mean, it's just the armed robbery counts that are going to move forward. The aggravated assault counts, which were 5, 6, 7, and 8, were dropped. The case was dropped as to DeAndre Baker. So you could argue that the state attorney's office
dropped as to Dunbar.
Case was dropped as to Dunbar. So the state attorney's office has dropped one complete case and halved the other case. So I wouldn't necessarily accuse them of overcharging here.
Now, Dan, I wanted to correct you, because you know who else might get dropped and all this? DeAndre Baker might get dropped. And now, we don't want to speak ill of someone's career, their livelihood. But you just read the writing on the wall. Aldrich Rosas, we spoke about it briefly. I know we both touched online. It was the Giants, Pro Bowl kicker, had a DWI charge, was covered in blood in a messy case. He's not on the team anymore. And Dan, I was with the Giants during the Plexico Burress situation back in the early 2010s. I think it was 2013 when this one happened. And Plexico Burress was let go from the New York Giants, even a very high level player like that. So you don't want to wish.
Yeah, I was going to say the Plexico Burress case really highlights the difficult financial situation the Giants are going to be in relative to the salary cap. The Giants tried to claw back Burress's signing bonus. And in fact, they did based upon language in the standard player contract. And Boris took the Giants and the NFL to arbitration over that and won the case because there were only, at least under the 2011 CBA, there were only four bases on which you can forfeit a player's already earned signing bonus. And shooting yourself in the leg in a nightclub wasn't one of them. Withholding your services, holding out, retiring, at least with respect to Baker, he hasn't yet satisfied one of those four grounds for withholding or clawing back a signing bonus. So I think what the Giants are going to do here is let the NFL take the lead and let the criminal justice system run its course. Because if and when he is convicted, then I think going forward, the Giants will have a much easier decision to make financially. And maybe the signing bonus can be clawed back in years 3, 4, and 5, but not necessarily this year or last year.
Dan, I think it's about that time we have our guest is Jeremy Kudon. And just a quick background on Jeremy. Jeremy went to Miami University. He's a Boston University School of Law grad. And Jeremy, we'll obviously get into it with him, but he has a load of sports knowledge. He works with a ton of these sports betting industries, from DraftKings to FanDuel, and he's very high-level conversations, legislation. So I know, Dan, this is your world. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of great questions for him. So with that being said, let us jump into the interview with Jeremy.
He is, in my view, the mastermind of online gambling legislation in the United States going back to 2015. He revolutionized and brought into legal clarity daily fantasy sports back in 2015, 16, 17, and he's now taking the lead on many of the legislative issues surrounding sports betting, and has been instrumental in getting laws passed in over a dozen states since the fall of PASPA. So I'm very excited about welcoming Jeremy to the program and to our podcast. And we're going to focus on a very unique issue today, which is, mobile sports wagering and what's taking place in Illinois, where the Illinois law requires customers that want to register mobile betting accounts to walk into a casino and open up their accounts in person rather than doing it remotely, as is the case with almost all forms of electronic commerce. And we're going to get into it with Jeremy as to why that took place, what are some of the political considerations surrounding that, and how that plays out in a COVID-19 environment. Joining us to shed some insight into this remote registration versus on-site registration issue is somebody well known to sports betting industry insiders. He's the founder and chair of Oryx Public Policy Group. Jeremy Kudon, a name that's familiar to many of you who've been following the travails of the fantasy sports industry. And more recently, he's representing DraftKings, FanDuel, Major League Baseball, the PGA Tour, and the National Basketball Association in trying to have sensible sports betting statutes and regulations enacted across the country. He's the man responsible for coordinating the 50-state lobbying campaign for both the fantasy sports industry and, more recently, the nascent sports betting industry. Jeremy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dan. That seems like such a big introduction for something that it's all good.
Well, that's our show, and that's it for today. Thank you very much. So, Jeremy, the first question I have for you is a softball right out of the gate. How on earth does the fifth largest state by population in the United States require its residents to sign up for a mobile sports betting account in person at a casino? How does that happen in a state that's so populous?
It's all about protectionism and trying to get, so this is very typical in state legislatures, and it's how I got into this industry in the first place, beyond just sports betting. It's about local interests dominating and trying to take advantage and get a leg up over the out-of-state competition. And we saw that with Rivers Casino, who lobbied for a bill that would have on-site. I initially lobbied to keep FanDuel and DraftKings out of the state so that they would have a huge competitive advantage. When they were unsuccessful doing that, they did the next best thing, which is say, okay, if you want to have mobile sports betting, you have to go to a casino and sign up for an account, almost like what you have to do when you go to Vegas, where, of course, you're on the strip. Here, the only casino that's near a major population center happens to be Rivers Casino in Des Plaines, right by the airport. So huge advantage for them, not great for the rest of the industry, for other than 10 other casinos in the state, and for anyone that honestly wants to do a deal with those casinos. And remember, it wasn't just the on-site registration. They also made it very difficult. The bill makes it very difficult for you to brand your, operations, so that you have to do something like, FanDuel at the Hollywood Park or something like that. So, I mean, this was truly the worst example of protectionist legislation. And it was pitched that way to legislators, and legislators pitched that back to us as why this was going to be what the bill was passed as.
Why is the issue of registering on site at a casino versus being able to register remotely for purposes of mobile sports wagering, why is that such an important issue today?
It's an important issue because the reality is the entire world is in our pockets now. I mean, this would be like saying the only way you can get an Amazon account is by going to the grocery store. That's ridiculous. Why should we? I mean, casinos are fine. Don't get me wrong. Good friends in the casino industry. But there's no reason we should be pushing people to go to a casino so they can have a mobile sports betting account. To make matters worse, when we think about the real competition in a sports betting market, a legal sports betting market, it's not necessarily FanDuel, DraftKings, Rivers. It's Bovada. It's mybookie.com. Those are sites I don't need to go to a casino to sign up for. The offshore illegal market is available today. I can sign up for it today, and I don't have to go to a casino or anywhere to do so. So I just think that this is very much a old school approach to a modern modern thing. And it is going to put that market back several years.
So, Jeremy, I have kind of first, you brought up something interesting. I think in this day and age with Major League Baseball, we don't want to be pushing anybody towards casinos because that could threaten the Major League Baseball season. So something I've kind of noticed, and I know you kind of are aware of the whole mobile betting industry. I think many people kind of looked at the pandemic and thought that sports legalization was going to jump up because of maybe just a shortage of funds, maybe for particular states. I've seen a couple, different facts and figures that actually the illegal market, be it the Bovada or the BetOnline.ag, that market is actually taking up. Do you have any kind of, thoughts on how the pandemic is affecting the overall sports betting and mobile betting industry?
So I look at it as, and I'll try to stay short because I see three different questions, Dan, that you just raised. One is, how is the mobile sports betting industry doing in a world for a little while where there was no sports? And what we saw was, the New Jersey numbers last month were outstanding. The Pennsylvania numbers were almost identical to pre-pandemic numbers when there was a full slate of sports. And they were betting on things like, table tennis. I guess that's what we call ping pong now.
We're aware of this ping pong trend.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Conversation.
But it shows, so here's the great thing for the future for clients like mine, DraftKings or FanDuel, where now you have a bettor that's much more aware of the different offerings of the company. They actually know more about Premier League soccer than they did. So those bettors are just going to be able to do more on the site than they were pre-pandemic. So for the future, it's great. I think that mobile sports betting has done tremendous. I think the problem is it's only legal in 14 states and really only operational, I think, in 9. There's still states that are working out their regulations. And so that interest in betting, especially right now, especially in what is the heyday of sports, we've probably never had this many sports in the summer ever, happening at the same time, where you have Champions League soccer, baseball, basketball. It's all amazing. And the problem, of course, with it is that in most of these states, in 40 states, you can't do it mobily. So that's going to be a huge boon to Bovada, to mybookie.com. And I think it's confused by the fact that you listen to talk radio. People are talking about mobile sports betting all the time. They're seeing the ads. And there's nothing stopping them from going offshore. So I think that boom, I think everybody is seeing that all boats are lifting, but the illegal books are lifting as well.
So kind of on that note, while we're seeing these different pandemic trends, and I think you're right. I think there is some misinformation about the availability of sports betting. I am Dan can speak to this. I'm kind of a fan of these. We'll say not necessarily the core sports, but there's a sport like the Drone Racing League, who recently had his partnership with FanDuel. So I'm watching just FanDuel take advantage of these, we'll say, kind of tertiary sports, or we'll say quasi sports, whatever you want to call it. What is your view on how a partner like FanDuel can help push up a sport like DRL or even a sport like Formula One, which isn't as big traditionally within the country?
I think what you're going to see, or what I imagine the vision is, and I remember talking to Jason Robbins about this in 2017. You're going to, and that was before we thought there'd be sports betting, but it was the idea that you could start to watch on the app DRL, Drone Racing League, or you could start to watch Formula One. Because it's hard to figure out what channel Formula One is on in the US. It's always on that sports package channel, and maybe it's NBC Sports at 6 a.m. But if that's on the FanDuel website or on the DraftKings website, you're going to watch it. And that's going to bring you to that site, and that's going to create interest. And I think that there's a lot of synergies. So we're going to start to see that, I believe, more of the synergies. And as people get more familiar with those sports, that's going to be great during the off seasons for the NFL. There's going to be gaps again at some point. There's going to be a big gap, it sounds like, on Saturdays.
Yeah, Jeremy, the situation with respect to COVID-19 is getting worse in Illinois. I think at the time that Governor Pritzker let the, suspension of the on-site registration requirements lapse, things were turning around for the better in Illinois. But over the last week to 10 days, there's been a resurgence. Experts have said that the next 2 to 4 weeks could be among the worst. The positivity rates are going up a little higher, 2,000 cases per day over the weekend. Where do you see this issue headed? And is Governor Pritzker's decision on this, kind of the final, nail in the coffin for the remote registration, or is there a possibility that this is an evolving issue?
So I think that I was really encouraged when when Governor Pritzker issued that executive order in late May, that I think did what made a lot of sense. Say, hey, we're not going to force people to go to a casino. At the time they were not open, but I felt like it would hold true even when they did and open at half capacity. We don't want to force anyone who's not comfortable. There are just plenty of people in New York. We're probably in the best position, in the country right now in terms of what's open and, our positivity rates. But look, I still don't run into we don't go indoor dining out in Long Island right now, even though it's available. You want to avoid certain things. His decision made a lot of sense. I think, I understand the casinos were closed then, and then he issued it again. He reissued it. Casinos are still closed for 3 more days. Casinos open. He doesn't rescind then. He rescinds just coincidentally, or he doesn't rescind. He just doesn't renew it coincidentally 1 day before DraftKings is supposed to go live. Was
that a coincidence in your view?
We don't believe in coincidences here. For the record, this is a safe space. We don't believe in them.
It's hard. It's hard to believe it was a coincidence. Others will tell you it's very hard to believe it's a coincidence. It's just consistent with the idea. Look, we passed a law that was supposed to help Rivers. It wasn't supposed to help DraftKings and FanDuel. Put aside the Dormant Commerce Clause. Put aside, the Equal Protection Clause. Let's just favor our in-state business. I mean, I did this for years, the Dormant Commerce Clause. This is a clear violation, but no one wants to sue because you still have to get licensed by the same state that you're suing. That's why you don't see lawsuits in this world.
Yeah, well, the irony of all this is that a casino, skews to among the youngest demographics in the country. I think mobile wagering, more than 50% of accounts that are associated with online gambling in the United States are 20 to 29, age range, and the age group for COVID-19 in Illinois that's most at risk right now, where the momentum seems to be growing, is in that 20 to 29 age group. So why is politics is the reason, but do you see that there's a real public health crisis associated with sending people to a casino that don't necessarily want to engage in business at a casino?
I simply don't understand it. We've made the point, people have made the point on social media. We've made the point in meetings with the governor's office, and it's head scratching. I think that Governor Pritzker has done 99.9% of the things right in the state. I think he is one of the best governors on COVID-19 out there. And I just don't know what happened on this one. It's just so contradictory to every other thing he's doing. And it's much needed revenue. The state is probably going to lose $8 million this month in tax revenue because of the decision to go back to on-site registration. And again, that's $8 million is not, in a time we're in right now, you really cannot afford to be picking winners and losers when the real losers are the people of the state who really need, help and services. And so $8 million is not going to cover their billions of dollars shortfall. But you know what? $8 million buys laptops for everybody in the Chicago public school system. So like the notion that we're just going to pick Rivers as a winner here, the only mobile app, by the way, that was operational when this order was in place, and say, hey, if you want to go sign up for DraftKings, drive 300 miles from Chicago to East St. Louis, which has a positivity rate of 15%, I think, right now, and risk your life. But, we don't want to hurt Rivers.
No, you're preaching to the choir. Okay, last question before, we have to, I guess, wrap up this particular segment. We ask all of our guests, this question. Most of our guests are lawyers. You've come really, you've made major strides in this industry. Can you give us some background on how you got into the gambling space, how you became one of the premier state legislative and government relations specialists in the area of emerging technologies? What's your backstory? And then, of course, the final question is, what states should we look ahead to for the remainder of this year for legalization of sports betting?
So I think the truth is like many people that I found in this space, I fell into it. I think that was true of you, probably both of you. I was doing state legislative campaigns for almost 8 years before I happened to send an email to Nigel Eccles at FanDuel as a whim, because I had seen that there were some issues. And that was in 2014, before the ads and before everything. I really kind of built my practice, and then I love sports. And so, it was exciting to be able to send something or try to do something that I love to combine it with what else with the other things I do. So that's how I got into it. And I think that's, build a skill, and then you can always, once you have that skill and expertise, you can always steer it towards this. I never thought I'd be representing Major League Baseball or the NBA. Or the PGA Tour. That was my childhood dream. I knew at an early age I wouldn't be playing for the Yankees. But I hoped I could be like a lawyer for the Yankees or something. So that's been a dream. I think it is, though, there is no such thing really as sports law. It's really, or gaming law, it's really about becoming just an expert at what you do or skills, whether you're a lawyer or whatever, and then applying those to this field. As for the states to watch, Massachusetts is obviously at the very top of the list. I expect something to be done in the fall. I hope it's done as part of the economic development bill, but if it slips to the budget, that wouldn't surprise me, nor, as long as the regulator gets something done quickly, that's not a problem to me. I think, the white whale, my home state of New York, is something I still have very high on the list. But truth be told, based on what Congress did or did not do, more specifically, last week on state and local aid, I think that we could see 8 to 10 states go into special session this fall.
Is New York going to be one of them? What's the deadline for the New York legislature during this calendar year? Because the session was supposed to end in June, and it's somewhat unknown to me where things stand in terms of the close of business for this legislative year.
So they can go all the way to December 31st. The problem is the state's going to run out of money. We have to have a balanced budget. Clearly, we don't have any revenue coming in, in the city and other places. So we are short billions right now. So I believe now, Governor Cuomo didn't want to do any new revenue, didn't even want to talk about potential new revenue items. And that's what they call taxes. That's a nice way of saying taxes. Didn't want to talk about it until Congress acted, because he wants the balance sheet to look as bad as possible to get more aid. And I'm fully in favor of that. But I think now where you're seeing a world where there's no way we're going to get what we want or as much as we need. They're going to have to go back and do other items. And you're going to see that in state after state after state after state.
All right. Well, Jeremy, we could go on for a long time. Sports betting is certainly one of the favorite topics for me on this show, and we could go for an hour. So we'll have to have you come back as we address some other states in the future, be they Massachusetts, New York, maybe even California, Texas, or Florida. So you have an open invitation to come back whenever you want. You certainly deliver a lot of terrific insight to us and our listeners. So thank you.
I appreciate it. And look, I'm just lucky to be with you guys. I know you guys have been out there for a while, and I enjoy seeing everything that you're doing.
So with that being said, Dan, we will put this episode in the books for Dan. Dan can be found on Twitter and Instagram at Wallach Legal. Myself, Dan Lusk, can be found Twitter, Instagram at Sports Law Lust. The show Conduct Detrimental can be found on social media at Condetrimental. And that's it. So we will see you next week. Dan, anything to add?
Nope. It's been another fun episode, and I look forward to joining you a week from now, maybe even sooner, as the sports legal landscape intensifies seemingly day by day by day. So have a great week. You and I obviously will stay in touch. And if anyone has suggestions for future episodes, guests, topics, you can slide into our DMs. And if we could ask one favor of our loyal audience, if you could drop into Apple and drop us a nice review, we would greatly appreciate it.
That goes for you too, Mike Piazza. We'll see you next week.